Close your eyes and imagine this with me. It's the year 843, and you're standing in the darkness before dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a single bell tolls across misty fields. The Roman Empire has crumbled into memory, but from its ashes, something extraordinary is being born. Not one story, but thousands, each one written in stone, painted in gold, carved into the very soul of civilization itself. Tonight, we journey into an age where art wasn't just decoration, it was prayer made visible, faith transformed into light and shadow. We're about to discover how Islamic geometries unlocked the mathematics of paradise, how medieval monks painted doorways to heaven, and how cathedral builders reached toward God with stones that still defy explanation today. But here's what your history books never told you. In the year 692, something happened in Jerusalem that would change art forever. A golden dome rose into the sky, covered with inscriptions that sparkled like captured starlight. This wasn't just a building, it was a mathematical poem, a visual argument that would echo through the centuries. And tonight you'll understand why this single monument holds the key to everything that followed. Welcome back to art history, piece by piece. I'm your guide through the shadows and light of the medieval world, where every image held the power of miracles, and every pattern contained the secrets of creation itself. Let me take you to a workshop in 8th century Damascus, where the morning light filters through wooden shutters, casting geometric shadows across stone floors. Here, in rooms that smell of sandalwood and heated metal, craftsmen are creating something the world has never seen before. Their hands move with the precision of prayer, etching patterns that seem to breathe and flow like living things. These aren't random decorations, they're visual equations, spiritual mathematics that map the infinite nature of Allah onto earthly surfaces. Watch as a single line curves and multiplies, creating stars within stars, flowers that bloom into infinity. But why geometric patterns? Why not faces, landscapes, the human form that had dominated art for millennia? The answer lies in a revolution of the spirit. Islamic art emerged from a radical new understanding of the divine, that God's beauty couldn't be captured in any single image, but only suggested through the endless repetition and variation of perfect mathematical relationships. It was abstract art born from the deepest faith, 15 centuries before Kandinsky ever picked up a brush. Picture yourself standing in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus around 715 CE. The walls shimmer with mosaics that seem to move in the candlelight, not depicting any earthly paradise, but creating one through pure pattern and color. Gold tesserae catch the light like captured prayers, while deep blues and greens flow in ribbons that have no beginning and no end. Here's what's remarkable. These artisans were inventing visual techniques that wouldn't appear in European art for another 600 years. They understood that art could be both intensely spiritual and rigorously intellectual, that beauty could emerge from mathematical precision rather than naturalistic representation. And in the markets beyond the mosque walls, something equally revolutionary was happening. Master calligraphers were transforming the very letters of the Quran into visual music. Arabic script flowed like water, like wind across sand dunes, each curve and dot placed with the precision of a master musician, hitting the perfect note. Ibn Muqla, working in Baghdad around 900 CE, established the proportional system that would govern Islamic calligraphy for over a millennium. He didn't just create letter forms. He created a visual language that could make the Word of God beautiful to the eye, as well as meaningful to the mind. Watch his reed pen move across parchment. Each stroke is both an act of worship and a work of art, but the real miracle was happening in the realm of architectural decoration. In places like the Alhambra, still being refined centuries later, artists were creating surfaces that seemed to dissolve the very boundaries of physical space. Muqarnas, those honeycomb-like decorative vaults, created the illusion that stone could be light, that ceiling could be sky. Close your eyes and imagine walking through these spaces. Your footsteps echo softly on marble floors, while above you, geometric stars seem to pulse with inner light. This is architecture as meditation, space as prayer, art as a direct pathway to the divine. And here's a mystery that scholars still debate. How did these medieval Islamic artists achieve such mathematical precision without modern measuring tools? Some patterns discovered in 13th century buildings display symmetries so complex that they weren't fully understood by Western mathematics until the 20th century. Were they working from ancient Greek texts? Had they discovered geometric principles independently? Or was there something else at work, a spiritual mathematics that emerged from pure devotion? As we leave this world of infinite patterns and liquid light, remember this: Islamic art was creating doorways to the eternal. Each geometric pattern was a meditation on the nature of infinity, each calligraphic curve a pathway toward the divine. But as this artistic revolution spread from Cordoba to Cairo, from Istanbul to Isfahan, something equally remarkable was stirring in the monasteries and cathedrals of medieval Europe. For in the candlelit scriptoriums of Ireland and the stone workshops of France, monks and craftsmen were about to embark on their own quest to make the invisible visible, to transform faith into art that would literally reach toward heaven itself. When books became universes, picture this. It's a winter morning in the year 800, somewhere on the wind-swept coast of Ireland. In a stone cell barely large enough for a man to stand upright, Brother Columba dips his quill into a pot of ultramarine blue, a pigment more valuable than gold, ground from lapis lazuli, carried by traders across continents. But what he's about to create isn't just a book. It's a universe contained within vellum pages, where every letter is a prayer and every margin blooms with creatures from both earth and imagination. This is the world of illuminated manuscripts, where art and faith dance together in harmonies so complex they still make scholars weep with wonder. The page before him shows the opening words of the Gospel of Matthew, Liber Generationis. But watch how these simple Latin words transform under his touch. The letter L grows like a living vine, sprouting leaves that shelter tiny birds, extending tendrils that wrap around geometric patterns, borrowed from metalwork, stone carving, and perhaps even dreams. Here's what makes this moment revolutionary. Brother Columba isn't just copying text. He's creating what scholars now recognize as some of the most sophisticated abstract design in human history. The Book of Kells, being crafted in monasteries just like this one, contains mathematical relationships and visual rhythms that wouldn't be seen again until the advent of modern graphic design. But why such complexity for books that only a handful of people would ever see? The answer reveals something profound about medieval consciousness. These monks understood that every act of creation was an echo of God's original creative act. To illuminate a manuscript was to participate in the ongoing creation of the universe, to add beauty to the world as a form of worship. Let your mind wander to another scriptorium, this time in medieval France around 1180. Here, in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, Brother Guillaume carefully applies gold leaf to the halo of an angel. But this isn't just decoration, it's theology made visible. Medieval artists believed that gold, being incorruptible, was the earthly representation of divine light itself. Watch as Guillaume's brush moves across the page. The angel's wings seem to shimmer with inner fire, while the background dissolves into patterns of infinite complexity. This is what art historians call horror vacui, the fear of empty space. But it's more than that. It's the medieval understanding that existence itself was so rich, so layered with meaning, that any empty space was a missed opportunity to glorify creation. And hidden within these illuminated pages are secrets that scholars are still uncovering. Recent analysis of medieval manuscripts has revealed that some contain color formulas that produce hues we can no longer replicate. The famous Marian blue found in books of hours wasn't just ultramarine. It was ultramarine mixed with ground pearls and other substances in proportions that created an otherworldly luminescence. But here's where the story becomes truly mysterious. Many of these illuminated manuscripts contain what scholars call carpet pages, entirely abstract geometric designs that serve no narrative function. They exist purely as visual music, as meditations on pattern and proportion. Some historians argue these represent the earliest truly abstract art in Western civilization, predating modern abstraction by 8 centuries. Brother Columba sets down his brush and steps back to examine his work. In the candlelight, the page seems to pulse with life. Tiny animals peer out from letter forms, mythical creatures dance in margins, and geometric patterns create visual rhythms that mirror the chanted prayers echoing through stone corridors. Now, transport yourself to Canterbury Cathedral around 1170. In the workshop attached to the cathedral, Master Edwine is working on something revolutionary, the first architectural plan that treats a building as a work of art in itself. The Canterbury Cathedral we know today was rising from the ashes of a devastating fire, and Edwine was documenting not just its structure, but its spiritual geometry. Medieval builders understood something we're only rediscovering today, that certain proportions and relationships create spaces that naturally elevate human consciousness. The golden ratio, the harmonic proportions found in music, the mathematical relationships that govern growth in nature, all of these were being built into stone and mortar. But Master Edwine's drawings reveal something else. Medieval artists saw no distinction between the practical and the spiritual, between engineering and theology. Every flying buttress was calculated not just to hold up stone, but to create the impression that the building was reaching toward heaven. Every window was positioned not just for light, but to create the sense that earthly walls were dissolving into celestial brightness as night falls over Canterbury. Imagine the effect these spaces must have had on medieval minds. In an age when most people lived in wooden huts with dirt floors, stepping into a great cathedral was like entering another dimension. The soaring stone arches, the colored light filtering through stained glass, the chanted prayers echoing off vaulted ceilings. This was virtual reality created through faith and artistic genius. And here's a detail that will amaze you. Recent acoustic analysis of medieval cathedrals has revealed that many were designed with specific sound properties in mind. The architects positioned columns and curved surfaces to create natural reverberation patterns that would make chanted prayers seem to come from the very walls themselves. They were creating immersive spiritual experiences centuries before anyone had words for such concepts. Brother Columba returns to his manuscript as dawn light begins to filter through the narrow window. The gold leaf catches the first rays of sun, and for a moment, his illuminated page seems to be lit from within. This is what medieval artists understood that we sometimes forget, that art isn't just about representation or beauty. It's about transformation. It's about creating objects and spaces that change the people who encounter them as he adds the final touches to his angel's wing. Brother Columba is participating in a tradition that stretches from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Ireland, from the workshops of Damascus to the scriptoriums of Tours. It's a tradition that sees art as prayer, creation as worship, and beauty as one of the primary languages through which the divine speaks to humanity. But as these illuminated universes multiplied in monastery scriptoriums, a new vision was emerging from the quarries and workshops of Europe, one that would literally reshape the skyline of Christendom and create spaces so impossibly beautiful that people still journey across the world just to stand within them. How Romanesque became romance. The year is 1073, and something extraordinary is happening in the hills of Burgundy. In a quarry outside the village of Cluny, stonecutters are shaping blocks of pale limestone under the watchful eye of Master Hugh. But these aren't ordinary building stones. Each one is being carved with the precision of a jeweler, designed to fit into a vision so ambitious it borders on madness. They're building the largest church in Christendom, a space so vast that when completed it could hold the entire population of most medieval towns. But size isn't what makes this revolutionary. It's the way Master Hugh and his craftsmen are solving problems that have puzzled builders since the fall of Rome. How do you create spaces that seem to float? How do you make stone walls disappear into light? How do you build churches that don't just house worship, but become worship itself? Close your eyes and step into this world with me. The air smells of limestone dust and wood smoke. Hammers ring against chisels in rhythms that echo like distant music. And everywhere, carved into the very fabric of the building, stories are being told in stone, not just Bible stories, but the entire medieval universe made visible in images that dance between the earthly and the divine. This is the birth of Romanesque art, and it's happening simultaneously across Europe like a coordinated awakening. From Santiago de Compostela in Spain to Durham Cathedral in England, from Speyer Cathedral in Germany to Sant'Ambrogio in Milan, master builders are rediscovering the lost secrets of monumental architecture. But here's what makes this moment truly remarkable. These medieval architects were working without blueprints as we know them. They carried the entire design of massive cathedrals in their heads, passing complex engineering knowledge from master to apprentice, through hands-on teaching that bordered on the mystical. They were part builder, part mathematician, part theologian, creating structures that solved engineering problems through pure intuition and faith. Watch Master Hugh as he examines a capital, that decorated top of a column, being carved by one of his sculptors. The stone seems to writhe with life. Mythical creatures chase each other around the circular form, their bodies intertwining with foliage that looks like it could burst into bloom at any moment. This isn't random decoration. Every image has meaning. Every creature tells a story that medieval worshippers would read like pages in a book. Here, a dragon represents the forces of chaos and evil. But look how the sculptor has positioned it, being trampled under the feet of a victorious saint. Over there, lions and eagles chase each other in endless circles, representing the eternal struggle between earthly and heavenly powers. And threading through everything, vine patterns that echo the words of Christ. I am the vine, you are the branches. But the real magic was happening in the architecture itself. Walk into the nave of Cluny with me, or rather, what remains of it, since most of this wonder was destroyed during the French Revolution. The stone barrel vaults soar overhead, like the hull of an inverted ship, supported by massive walls that seem impossibly thick until you realize they're not just walls. They're complex structures of stone and space designed to carry unimaginable weight while creating the illusion of weightlessness. Medieval builders had rediscovered something the Romans knew, but that had been forgotten for centuries. That stone could be made to behave like liquid. That weight could be distributed through curves and buttresses in ways that made the heaviest materials seem to float. But they went beyond Roman engineering. They were creating buildings that weren't just structurally sound. They were emotionally and spiritually transformative. Here's a mystery that still puzzles architectural historians. How did medieval builders, working without modern mathematical tools, achieve such structural perfection? Recent computer modeling of Romanesque churches reveals engineering principles so sophisticated that they wouldn't be understood theoretically until centuries later. Were they working from lost Roman texts? Had they developed their own advanced mathematical understanding? Or was there something else, a kind of intuitive engineering that emerged from deep spiritual conviction? Consider this extraordinary detail. Many Romanesque churches were designed with acoustic properties so precise that a whisper at the altar could be heard clearly in the farthest corner of the nave. The builders weren't just creating visual experiences. They were creating total sensory environments where every sight, sound, and even smell was orchestrated to induce specific spiritual states. Now, let me take you to a smaller church, the Sainte Foy at Conques. Around 1130, above the main entrance, carved in stone relief, is one of the most powerful artistic statements of the medieval period. The Last Judgment tympanum. Christ sits in majesty at the center. But look at how the sculptor has arranged the surrounding figures. Saved souls rise toward heaven with expressions of rapturous joy, while the damned are dragged toward hell by demons whose grotesque faces still have the power to terrify modern viewers. This isn't just art, it's spiritual theater carved in stone, designed to prepare worshippers psychologically and emotionally for the experience they're about to have inside the church. Medieval artists understood what modern psychologists have rediscovered, that the state of mind you bring to an experience fundamentally shapes that experience itself. Master Gislebertus, who signed his name to the great tympanum at Audum, was creating more than decoration. He was crafting a visual narrative so powerful that illiterate peasants could read it like a book. so emotionally compelling that it could change lives, so artistically sophisticated that 8 centuries later, it still makes art and historians gasp with admiration. But here's what truly sets Romanesque art apart: its incredible diversity within unity. While Islamic art achieved its effects through geometric repetition and variation, Romanesque art exploded into a carnival of forms, stories, and symbols. Every region developed its own distinctive style, yet somehow they all belonged to the same artistic universe. In Spain, Romanesque sculpture absorbed influences from Islamic art, creating hybrid forms that belonged fully to neither tradition, yet somehow transcended both. In England, Norman builders brought continental techniques, but adapted them to local materials and traditions, creating something entirely new. In Italy, classical Roman forms were reinterpreted through medieval eyes, producing art that was simultaneously ancient and revolutionary. And threading through all of this diversity was a common understanding that art wasn't luxury or decoration. It was necessity, as essential to human flourishing as food or shelter. Medieval people invested enormous resources in churches, not because they were wealthy, most were desperately poor, but because they understood something we're only beginning to rediscover: that beauty has the power to transform consciousness itself. As Master Hugh surveys his nearly completed church at Cluny, watching the afternoon light stream through high windows and turn the limestone walls golden, he knows he's participated in something miraculous. He's helped create a space where the boundary between earth and heaven becomes permeable, where stone architecture creates the conditions for spiritual transcendence. But even as Romanesque art reached its full flowering, something new was stirring in the Ile-de-France. Abbot Suger at Saint-Denis was having visions of churches made of light itself, spaces so revolutionarily beautiful that they would make the greatest Romanesque achievements seem heavy and earthbound by comparison. For in the workshops of medieval France, architects and craftsmen were about to discover the secret of making stone walls disappear entirely, creating buildings that seemed to be constructed from crystallized light and sanctified space itself. When architecture became music made visible, something impossible happened in the summer of 1140. At the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris, Abbot Suger stood in his newly consecrated choir and watched something that had never been seen before in the history of architecture. The morning light streaming through his revolutionary stained glass windows wasn't just illuminating the space, it was transforming it into something that seemed to exist beyond the physical world. The stone walls had essentially disappeared, replaced by soaring expanses of colored glass that turned sunlight into liquid jewels. This wasn't just architectural innovation. It was a complete revolution in how humans could experience enclosed space. Suture had discovered how to build with light itself. Close your eyes and step into this moment with me. The year is 1144, and you're entering what Suger called his new light for the dedication ceremony. Kings and queens, bishops and abbots from across Europe have come to witness something unprecedented. As you cross the threshold, your breath catches. The columns seem impossibly slender, rising like stone trees into vaults so high they disappear into the blue-tinted mystery. And everywhere, washing over altars, pooling on floors, dancing across walls, colored light moves with the living quality of water or flame. This is the birth of Gothic architecture, but it's so much more than a new building style. It's a complete reimagining of the relationship between spiritual aspiration and physical space, between earthly materials and heavenly vision. Suture and his master builder weren't just constructing a church, they were engineering transcendence itself. But how did they achieve this miracle of dematerialization? The secret lies in innovations so technically sophisticated that they wouldn't be fully understood until modern engineering analysis. The pointed arch, the flying buttress, the ribbed vault, these weren't just aesthetic choices. They were elements of a structural system that could distribute the enormous weight of stone roofs in such a way that walls could be opened up into vast expanses of window. Picture the workshop attached to Saint Denis, where master craftsmen are solving problems that have never been solved before. How do you calculate the exact angle of a flying buttress so it can support tremendous lateral forces while remaining virtually invisible from inside the church? How do you design window tracery that's strong enough to hold heavy glass, yet delicate enough to seem like frozen lace? How do you create vaulting systems that can cover enormous spaces while giving the impression of weightlessness? Watch as Master Guillaume, Suger's chief architect, sketches designs on a wax tablet. His hands move with the confidence of someone who understands that every line he draws will eventually become tons of precisely cut stone, flying through space in perfect balance. He's working from principles that combine advanced engineering with deep theological understanding. For in Suger's vision, the technical and the spiritual were inseparable. Suger himself wrote about his revolutionary church in terms that sound almost mystical. The wonderful and uninterrupted light of most luminous windows pervading the interior beauty. He understood that he was creating something that had never existed before, architecture that was fundamentally about light rather than mass, about transparency rather than solidity, about aspiration rather than enclosure. But the real revolution was happening in the glass workshops. Master glaziers were developing techniques for creating windows that weren't just transparent. They were transformative. Each piece of glass was individually colored, cut, and leaded into compositions that told stories, created moods, and most importantly, transformed ordinary daylight into what Suger called divine illumination. Imagine yourself in one of these workshops around 1150. The air shimmers with heat from the furnaces where glass is being blown and shaped. Craftsmen hold ruby red and sapphire blue glass up to the light, testing how different thicknesses and textures will affect the final window. They're not just making decorations, they're engineering emotional and spiritual experiences, creating surfaces that will transform light in ways calculated to induce specific states of consciousness in viewers. Here's a detail that will amaze you. Recent analysis of medieval stained glass has revealed that the colors were achieved through techniques so advanced they included nanotechnology, literally manipulating materials at the molecular level to create specific optical effects. The famous Chartres blue contains gold particles so small they could only be detected with 20th century equipment. Yet medieval glaziers knew exactly how to create and use them. But the revolution that began at Saint Denis was just starting to spread across Europe. By 1200, Gothic cathedrals were rising from foundations across the continent, each one pushing the possibilities further. At Chartres, builders discovered how to create windows so large they seemed to turn the entire building into a lantern. At Reims, craftsmen developed stone carving techniques so refined that architectural elements seemed to be growing rather than built. At Amiens, engineers achieved interior spaces so vast they could hold entire towns within their naves. Travel with me to Chartres around 1220, where one of the most extraordinary artistic collaborations in history is reaching completion. unknown master builders, sculptors, glaziers, and carvers are working together to create a building that functions like a three-dimensional illuminated manuscript, where every surface tells part of an interconnected story about the relationship between heaven and earth. Stand in the nave and look around you. Every capital tells a different story. Here, the creation of the world unfolds in stone reliefs, so fine they seem carved by angels. There, the lives of saints are depicted with psychological subtlety that wouldn't be seen again until Renaissance painting. Above you, the great rose window transforms afternoon sunlight into cascades of purple and gold that seem to flow like celestial music made visible. But it's the total effect that truly stuns. Gothic cathedrals weren't just buildings. They were comprehensive art forms that combined architecture, sculpture, painting, decorative arts, and even music into unified experiences that engaged every sense simultaneously. Medieval worshippers weren't just looking at art. They were literally surrounded by it, breathing it, moving through it in a kind of total aesthetic immersion that modern museums can only dream of achieving. And here's something that will change how you think about medieval people. These cathedrals were built by communities that often included no more than a few thousand inhabitants. Entire towns would devote their resources for generations to create buildings whose beauty and technical sophistication rival anything produced by our modern civilization. They understood something about the relationship between beauty and human flourishing that our pragmatic age has largely forgotten. Consider the mystery of the labyrinth at Chartres, that circular maze inlaid in the cathedral floor. Pilgrims would walk its winding path on their knees, following a route that took them on a symbolic journey, from earthly confusion to divine clarity. This wasn't just decoration, it was interactive art, architecture that required the participation to achieve its full meaning. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Gothic cathedrals was their approach to time. Unlike earlier architectural styles that emphasized permanence and solidity, Gothic buildings were designed to change continuously throughout the day and seasons. The moving light through stained glass windows meant that the interior was never the same twice. That morning worship felt completely different from evening vespers. Master Jean de Chelles, working on Notre Dame de Paris around 1250, understood that he was creating a building that would be experienced differently by every visitor at every moment. The great rose windows weren't just beautiful. They were chronometers of colored light, marking the passage of hours through shifts in hue and intensity that could be read like sundials. As evening approaches at Chartres, watch what happens to the light. The western windows, which appeared almost colorless in the morning sun, now glow with inner fire as the setting sun passes through them. The entire building seems to breathe with changing light, its stone bones animated by an illumination that feels more alive than artificial. This is what Gothic architects achieved that no one had accomplished before. They created buildings that weren't just containers for spiritual experience. They were active participants in that experience, changing and responding to natural rhythms in ways that made them feel more like living entities than static structures. But even as Gothic architecture achieved its full flowering in the great cathedrals of the 13th century, new ideas were stirring in the Italian peninsula. Artists there were beginning to look at those ancient Roman ruins scattered across their landscape with new eyes, beginning to wonder if the artistic achievements of antiquity might be not just admired, but actually surpassed. For in the workshops of Tuscany and the studios of Florence, painters and sculptors were about to embark on the most audacious artistic project in human history, the attempt to not just represent the world, but to recreate it entirely, to become rivals of God Himself in the act of creation. When artists became creators, in a small workshop in Florence on a winter morning in 1305, something extraordinary is about to happen. Giotto di Bondone stands before a freshly prepared wall in the Arena Chapel. His brush is loaded with pigments that seem to glow in the pale light, filtering through Gothic windows. But what he's about to paint will shatter every assumption about what art can do, what images can accomplish, what it means to create with human hands. He's not going to decorate this wall. He's going to make it disappear entirely, replacing the physical surface with a window into another world, so convincing, so emotionally powerful, that viewers will feel they can step through the painted surface into the scenes themselves. This is the moment when art stopped being about decoration and became about recreation, the moment when human artists began to compete with divine creation itself. Close your eyes and enter this revolutionary moment with me. The chapel smells of wet plaster and linseed oil, of the beeswax candles that provide steady light for detailed work. Giotto moves his brush with a confidence that seems almost supernatural, each stroke calculated not just for color and form, but for psychological and emotional effect. He's painting the lamentation over Christ, but he's not just illustrating a Bible story. He's creating a meditation on grief so profound, it will move viewers to tears 7 centuries later. Watch how he positions the figures. The Virgin Mary cradles her dead son with a tenderness that transcends religious doctrine and becomes purely, universally human. The angels above don't float in the stylized positions of Byzantine art. They writhe with genuine anguish, their expressions individualized, their grief as real as that of any mourning parent, and behind them, the landscape itself seems to participate in the tragedy. Barren trees, weeping sky, earth that appears to mourn. This is what art historians call the Renaissance. But that word, rebirth, doesn't capture what was really happening. This wasn't a return to classical antiquity. It was the birth of something entirely new. The idea that human artists could create works that rivaled nature itself in their power to move and transform viewers. Giotto wasn't just painting religious scenes. He was inventing visual psychology. But how did this revolution begin? The answer takes us back to the trade routes that connected medieval Europe with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Italian merchants, growing wealthy from commerce, began to encounter artistic traditions that emphasized different values from Northern Gothic art. Byzantine mosaics showed them how figures could have monumental presence. Islamic mathematics introduced them to perspective systems that could create convincing illusions of three-dimensional space. And classical Roman sculptures scattered throughout Italian cities demonstrated how stone could be made to seem like living flesh. Picture yourself in the workshop of Nicola Pisano around 1260, where this revolutionary consciousness was first taking shape. Pisano is carving a pulpit for the baptistery in Pisa, and something unprecedented is happening. Instead of stylized medieval figures that exist primarily as symbols, he's creating people who seem to breathe, to think, to feel. His Virgin Mary in the nativity scene doesn't just represent motherhood. She embodies it with a specificity and emotional truth that makes viewers feel they're witnessing the actual historical moment. But Pisano's revolution was just beginning. Watch as his son Giovanni pushes these discoveries even further. In his facade sculptures for Siena Cathedral, completed around 1290, figures seem to step out from their architectural frames. They gesture with natural movements. Their drapery falls in believable folds. Their faces show individual personalities rather than generic types. Giovanni Pisano is discovering that art can be both deeply spiritual and completely naturalistic, that making images more lifelike actually makes them more powerful as objects of devotion. Now, return with me to Giotto's workshop, where this sculptural revolution is being translated into painting. But Giotto is achieving something even more radical than the Pisanos. He's discovering how to paint not just individual figures, but entire convincing environments. How to create the illusion that painted walls open onto real spaces where actual events are unfolding. Look at his technique in the arena chapel frescoes. Each scene is composed like a stage set, with architectural elements that create believable three-dimensional spaces. The figures don't float against gold backgrounds like Byzantine icons. They stand on solid ground, cast shadows, interact with their environments in ways that make viewers feel they're witnessing actual events, rather than symbolic representations. Here's what makes this revolutionary. Giotto is discovering that the more realistically you can paint something, the more powerfully it can affect viewers emotionally and spiritually. By making religious scenes look like actual events, he's making them psychologically immediate in ways that symbolic art never could achieve. But there's a deeper revolution happening here, one that will transform not just art, but human consciousness itself. Medieval artists had worked anonymously, seeing themselves as craftsmen serving God and community. But Renaissance artists like Giotto were beginning to sign their work, to see themselves as individual creators whose personal vision and skill were part of what made art valuable. This shift from anonymous craft to individual creation represents one of the most profound changes in human self-understanding. Artists were beginning to see themselves as having something like divine creative power, the ability to bring new worlds into existence through their imagination and skill. This wasn't just ego, it was a revolution in what humans believed themselves capable of accomplishing. Travel with me to another Florentine workshop around 1320, where a young artist named Masaccio is pushing Giotto's discoveries to their logical conclusion. In his frescoes for the Brancacci Chapel, Masaccio will achieve something that seems almost magical, the complete illusion that painted figures exist in the same space as viewers. His Adam and Eve being expelled from paradise don't just represent the biblical story. They seem to be actual naked people, their faces twisted with shame and grief, so convincing that viewers can almost hear their cries. How is Masaccio achieving these effects? He's discovering the mathematical principles of linear perspective, the geometric system that can create perfect illusions of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces. But more than that, he's learning how light and shadow can be used to model forms, so convincingly that painted figures seem to possess actual physical weight and volume. Here's a detail that reveals the depth of this revolution. Masaccio's Holy Trinity, painted around 1427, contains one of the first architecturally accurate uses of perspective in Western art. The painted barrel vault above the crucified Christ follows mathematical rules so precise that you can calculate the exact position where viewers must stand to see it correctly. Masaccio isn't just painting an image. He's engineering a visual experience that exists in the same spatial reality as the viewers themselves. But why was this perspective revolution happening in Italy specifically? The answer lies in a unique combination of circumstances. Italian city-states had developed economies based on banking and trade that required sophisticated mathematical understanding. Italian scholars had access to both Islamic mathematical treatises and rediscovered classical Roman texts on optics and geometry, and Italian artists working for wealthy patrons who wanted art that demonstrated their cultural sophistication were encouraged to experiment with new techniques. Consider Brunelleschi's experiments in Florence around 1415. He's not just an architect, he's an artist-engineer who's systematically investigating how vision itself works. His famous demonstration panels, where he proved that mathematical perspective could create perfect illusions of real buildings, weren't just artistic exercises. They were scientific investigations into the nature of perception itself. Standing in the Piazza del Duomo, Brunelleschi holds up a small painted panel showing the baptistery of San Giovanni. But this isn't just a picture. It's a machine for seeing. Through a small hole drilled in the panel, viewers look at the reflection of the painting in a mirror positioned to show the actual building behind it. When Brunelleschi removes the mirror, the transition from painted image to real architecture is so seamless that observers can't tell where art ends and reality begins. This experiment represents something unprecedented in human history: the mathematical conquest of visual reality. Brunelleschi has discovered that three-dimensional space can be translated into two-dimensional images, using geometric principles so precise they function like equations. He's not just making pictures, he's creating visual mathematics that can reproduce any conceivable space or object with perfect accuracy. But here's what makes this moment truly revolutionary. These artistic discoveries are happening simultaneously with parallel breakthroughs in science, philosophy, and human self-understanding. The same mathematical thinking that allows artists to create perfect perspective is enabling navigators to map the globe, architects to design unprecedented structures, and scholars to develop new models of how the universe itself is organized. As twilight settles over Florence, Brunelleschi returns to his workshop, knowing he's unlocked one of the fundamental secrets of creation: how to make the invisible visible, how to translate imagination into convincing reality. But even as he carefully stores his demonstration panels, other artists throughout Italy are preparing to push these discoveries toward achievements that will make his experiments seem like mere preparation for miracles yet to come. For in the hills of Tuscany and the palaces of Rome, a new generation of artists was about to emerge, individuals whose names would become synonymous with human genius itself, who would create works so perfect they would be called divine, and who would establish art as one of the highest expressions of human capability. When mortals touched perfection, the year is 1501, and in a modest workshop in Florence, something is about to emerge from a 17-foot block of Carrara marble that will change forever how humans think about the possibilities of artistic creation. Michelangelo Buonarroti, barely 26 years old, approaches the stone that previous sculptors have abandoned as flawed, unusable. But where others see imperfection, he envisions something that will embody the absolute peak of human artistic achievement. He doesn't see marble. He sees David. Not the boy who slew Goliath, but David in the moment before the battle, his body coiled with potential energy, his mind calculating, his spirit burning with righteous determination. This won't just be a sculpture. It will be courage itself made visible in stone, a meditation on human potential so powerful that it will inspire revolutions and topple governments. Close your eyes and enter this workshop with me. The air is thick with marble dust that catches the morning light like powdered stars. Michelangelo moves around the block with the confidence of someone who can see through solid stone to the perfect form waiting within. Each blow of his chisel is calculated not just for shape and proportion, but for psychological effect. He's not carving a statue. He's liberating a living being from its marble prison. This is the High Renaissance. That brief, miraculous period when artistic achievement reached heights that still seem impossible. In workshops across Italy, artists are producing works that don't just represent perfection. They embody it so completely that viewers are left speechless, transformed by encounters with beauty so absolute it seems to emanate from divine rather than human sources. But how did this happen? How did human creativity suddenly explode into achievements that still define what we mean by artistic genius? The answer lies in a unique convergence of circumstances that has never been repeated. Italian city-states had developed unprecedented wealth through banking and trade. Classical learning was being recovered and disseminated through the revolutionary new technology of printing. And, most importantly, a new class of patrons had emerged who understood that artistic achievement could immortalize both artist and sponsor in ways that military conquest or political power never could. Picture yourself in the court of Lorenzo de' Medici around 1480, where this transformation of artistic consciousness is taking visible shape. Here, in the gardens of the Palazzo Medici, young artists like Michelangelo are studying classical sculptures not as artifacts from a dead past, but as challenges to be met and surpassed. They're learning that art isn't just about representing the world, it's about perfecting it, about creating versions of reality more beautiful and meaningful than anything nature produces on its own. Watch as young Michelangelo examines a Roman torso, running his fingers over marble surfaces carved 15 centuries earlier. He's not just admiring ancient skill, he's analyzing it, understanding how those long-dead sculptors achieved their effects, and planning how he can exceed their achievements. This isn't reverence for the past, it's competition with it. Renaissance artists saw themselves as engaged in a kind of Olympics of creativity, where the prizes were immortal fame and the satisfaction of having touched absolute perfection. But there's a deeper revolution happening here, one that transforms the very meaning of what it is to be human. Medieval artists had seen themselves as humble servants of God, creating works that pointed beyond themselves toward divine truth. Renaissance artists were beginning to see themselves as having almost godlike creative powers, the ability to conceive and execute works that rivaled divine creation itself. This shift represents one of the most profound changes in human self-understanding. When Michelangelo carved his name into the Pietà, the only work he ever signed, he wasn't just claiming authorship. He was declaring that human artists could create objects worthy of worship, that mortal hands could produce immortal beauty. Now travel with me to another workshop, this one in Milan around 1495, where Leonardo da Vinci is attempting something that borders on the impossible. He's not just painting a portrait of a merchant's wife. He's trying to capture the very essence of mysterious femininity itself. The woman who will become known as the Mona Lisa sits patiently as Leonardo applies layer after layer of translucent paint, building up an image so subtly modeled, so psychologically complex, that viewers will spend centuries trying to decode her expression. Here's what makes Leonardo's approach revolutionary. He's not just representing what he sees, he's investigating it scientifically. His notebooks are filled with anatomical drawings based on actual dissections, with studies of water flow and cloud formation. with engineering designs for flying machines and underwater vessels. Leonardo understands that to be a complete artist, you must first understand how everything in the natural world actually works. Watch him paint the Mona Lisa's hands. Each fingertip is positioned with mathematical precision, yet the overall effect is one of complete natural ease. This combination of scientific accuracy with artistic sensitivity represents something unprecedented in human achievement. The marriage of analytical thinking with creative vision in a single extraordinary mind. But Leonardo's real masterpiece is taking shape on the wall of a monastery refectory in Milan. The Last Supper isn't just a painting, it's a psychological drama where every gesture, every expression, every architectural element contributes to a narrative so compelling that viewers feel they're witnessing the actual biblical event. Leonardo has discovered how to paint not just what people look like, but what they're thinking and feeling. Consider the technical innovation required to achieve these effects. Leonardo is inventing new painting techniques, new ways of organizing pictorial space, new methods for creating the illusion that painted figures exist in the same reality as viewers. His sfumato, that subtle gradation of tones without harsh lines, creates modeling so convincing that painted faces seem to have actual skin rather than pigmented surfaces. Meanwhile, in Rome, a young artist named Raffaello Sanzio, known to us as Raphael, is achieving something equally miraculous in the papal apartments of the Vatican. His school of Athens, painted around 1510, represents not just the history of philosophy, but the absolute peak of Renaissance artistic confidence. Here, in a single composition, Raphael demonstrates that modern artists can create spaces more perfect than any actual architecture, populate them with figures more ideal than any living models, and organize the whole into a visual harmony that surpasses anything achieved by the ancients. Look at how Raphael has arranged the figures. Plato and Aristotle walk together at the center, their gestures embodying their philosophical differences. Plato pointing upward toward the realm of ideas, Aristotle gesturing toward the earthly world of experience. Around them, dozens of other philosophers engage in discussions and demonstrations, each figure individualized, yet contributing to an overall composition of perfect balance and movement. But here's the truly revolutionary aspect. Raphael has given many of these ancient philosophers the faces of contemporary Renaissance artists. That brooding figure in the foreground, representing the philosopher Heraclitus, has the features of Michelangelo. The idealized portrait of Plato resembles Leonardo da Vinci. Raphael is declaring that Renaissance artists are the equals of ancient philosophers, that they too are engaged in the pursuit of absolute truth and beauty. This confidence in human creative potential reaches its absolute peak in Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Starting in 1508, working alone on scaffolding 40 feet above the floor, Michelangelo transforms the ceiling into a vast meditation on human creation and potential. The famous scene of God giving life to Adam isn't just illustration of the biblical text. It's a visual theology that places human beings at the center of divine creation. Watch God's fingers stretch toward Adam's in that iconic scene. The space between their fingertips, barely an inch of painted plaster, contains one of the most profound statements ever made about human dignity and potential. Adam's body has the perfection of classical sculpture, but his face shows the awakening consciousness of a being capable of choice, creativity, and moral responsibility. Michelangelo is painting humanity itself as the pinnacle of divine creation, but there's something even more radical happening here. By depicting himself among the figures in the Last Judgment, Michelangelo is claiming that artists participate in divine creation, that the act of making art is itself a sacred activity worthy of the same reverence accorded to religious devotion. As you stand in the Sistine Chapel today, looking up at those figures that seem to move and breathe despite being made of mere pigment and plaster, you're witnessing the moment when human artistic achievement touched absolute perfection. Michelangelo created not just decoration for a church ceiling, but a visual universe so complete and convincing that it rivals the created world itself. Here's a mystery that still puzzles art historians. How did Renaissance artists achieve such perfect understanding of human anatomy, of perspective, of light and shadow, working without the scientific instruments and theoretical knowledge available to modern artists? Recent analysis suggests they were conducting systematic investigations that amounted to original scientific research, that they were discovering fundamental principles about vision, proportion, and human psychology through the process of making art itself. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Renaissance artists was their ability to combine technical perfection with profound emotional and spiritual content. These weren't just displays of skill. They were meditations on the deepest questions of human existence. What does it mean to be created in God's image? How can mortal beings create works of immortal beauty? What is the relationship between earthly love and divine love, between human creativity and divine creation? As the 16th century progressed, these questions would become even more urgent and complex. The Protestant Reformation was challenging the entire visual culture of Christianity. New world discoveries were expanding human understanding of what was possible, and a new generation of artists was preparing to push Renaissance discoveries toward achievements that would be even more emotionally powerful, even more technically sophisticated, even more psychologically complex. For in the workshops of Rome and Venice, in the courts of Spain and France, artists were about to discover that perfection itself could be improved upon, that classical harmony could be infused with the dramatic emotion, that Renaissance idealism could be charged with Baroque passion, creating art forms that would move viewers not just to admiration, but to actual transformation of consciousness. When art became pure emotion, Rome, 1600. In the flickering candlelight of the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo, something is about to happen that will forever change what art can do to human consciousness. Michelangelo Merisi, known to history as Caravaggio, stands before a canvas that shows the moment of St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. But this isn't the traditional representation you might expect. No heavenly host, no blazing divine light, no symbolic apparatus of miraculous intervention. Instead, Paul lies sprawled in the dirt, his horse standing placidly beside him, an ordinary groom holding the reins, with the bored expression of someone who has seen this sort of thing before. Yet somehow, impossibly, this utterly mundane scene pulses with spiritual electricity that makes every previous religious painting seem pale and lifeless by comparison. Close your eyes and enter this revolutionary moment with me. The church smells of incense and melting wax, but what draws your attention is the painting itself, which seems to glow with an inner light that has nothing to do with the candles flickering around it. Caravaggio has discovered something that will transform art forever. That the most profound spiritual experiences often happen not in moments of obvious divine intervention, but in the midst of ordinary, earthy, deeply human circumstances. This is the birth of Baroque art, But that term doesn't capture the real revolution happening here. This is the moment when artists discover that their highest calling isn't to create beauty or demonstrate technical skill. It's to move viewers so powerfully that looking at art becomes a form of spiritual experience, as intense as prayer or ecstasy. Watch how Caravaggio has positioned the light in this painting. It doesn't come from any natural source. There's no visible window, no torch, no lamp. Instead, it seems to emanate from the divine encounter itself, illuminating Paul's face with a radiance that makes his spiritual transformation visible to the eye. Caravaggio is painting the moment when the invisible becomes visible, when grace takes physical form. But here's what makes this truly revolutionary. Caravaggio's religious figures aren't idealized like Renaissance saints. They're real people, working-class Romans with dirty fingernails and weathered faces. People who look like they've actually lived in the world, rather than floating above it in realms of classical perfection. Yet somehow, this earthiness makes the spiritual content more powerful rather than less. These aren't distant theological abstractions. They're neighbors, fellow humans, touched by the same divine forces that operate in every ordinary life. Picture the scandal this caused in early 17th century Rome. Church authorities had expected paintings that would elevate viewers above earthly concerns toward contemplation of heavenly perfection. Instead, Caravaggio was giving them religious art that insisted heaven was already present in the earthly world. That divinity could be encountered in the face of a peasant or the gesture of a laborer. But Caravaggio's revolution was just the beginning. Across Europe, artists were discovering that Renaissance perfection, however admirable, had become emotionally cold, psychologically distant. A new generation was emerging that wanted art to grab viewers by the throat, to move them to tears or ecstasy, to create experiences so intense they bordered on religious conversion. Travel with me to another Roman workshop around 1620, where Gian Lorenzo Bernini is attempting something that seems impossible, even by the ambitious standards of his time. He's carving marble, cold, hard, lifeless stone, in such a way that it will seem to capture a moment of pure spiritual ecstasy. His sculpture of Saint Teresa will show the moment when divine love penetrates human consciousness like a golden arrow, transforming agony into bliss, earthly experience into heavenly rapture. Watch Bernini's chisel move across the marble surface. He's not just creating forms, he's choreographing an entire theatrical experience. The saint's robes seem to flutter as if moved by celestial winds. Her face shows an expression so psychologically complex, it seems to shift and change as you move around the sculpture. The angel beside her smiles, with a tenderness that makes viewers feel they're witnessing actual divine love made visible. Here's the technical miracle. Bernini is making marble behave like fabric, like flesh, like fire. The stone seems to glow from within, to move with living rhythms, to pulse with emotional energy. He's not just representing St. Teresa's mystical experience. He's recreating it so convincingly that viewers undergo their own version of the spiritual transformation the sculpture depicts. But Bernini's real innovation lies in his understanding of total environment. The ecstasy of St. Teresa isn't just a sculpture. It's the centerpiece of an entire chapel, designed to create the conditions for mystical experience. Hidden windows provide light that seems to emanate from heaven itself. Gilded rays stream down from above like materialized divine energy. Even the architecture participates in the spiritual drama, with curved walls that seem to breathe and pulse with supernatural life. This is what art historians call the Baroque synthesis. the combination of all artistic media into unified experiences that engage every sense simultaneously. But it's more than artistic innovation. It's a new understanding of what art can accomplish in human lives, how visual experience can be orchestrated to induce specific psychological and spiritual states. Meanwhile, in Spain, another artist is pushing these discoveries toward achievements that seem to transcend the merely human. Diego Velázquez, working in the court of Philip IV, is creating paintings that don't just represent reality. They seem to contain it so completely that the boundary between painted image and actual experience dissolves entirely. Stand with me in front of Las Meninas, painted around 1656. At first glance, it appears to show the Spanish royal family posing for a portrait. But look more carefully. Velázquez has included himself in the painting, palette and brushes in hand, looking directly at you, the viewer. The mirror in the background shows the reflection of the king and queen, but they're standing exactly where you're standing as you look at the painting. Velázquez is creating a visual puzzle that makes you question what's real and what's representation, what's art and what's life. Here's the philosophical revolution hidden in this seemingly straightforward court painting. Velázquez is suggesting that all reality might be a kind of representation, that what we take for solid, objective truth might actually be a series of reflections and interpretations. He's anticipating insights about the nature of consciousness and reality that won't be articulated by philosophers until centuries later. But the Baroque Revolution wasn't limited to individual masterpieces. Entire cities were being transformed into theatrical stages for the display of spiritual and political power. In Rome, Bernini designed the colonnade of St. Peter's Square to create the experience of being embraced by the arms of Mother Church herself. The curved columns don't just frame the space, they orchestrate the psychological experience of approaching the center of Catholic Christianity. Picture yourself as a 17th century pilgrim walking into that vast oval space for the first time. The columns seem to move as you walk, creating visual rhythms that guide your steps toward the basilica entrance. The scale is calculated to make individual humans feel simultaneously humble and elevated, small enough to recognize divine majesty, yet important enough to be worthy of such architectural splendor. This is architecture as psychology, space designed to induce specific emotional and spiritual states. Baroque architects understood something that modern urban planners are only rediscovering, that the spaces we inhabit shape our consciousness as powerfully as the ideas we think or the relationships we maintain. But perhaps the most revolutionary Baroque achievement was happening in the realm of ceiling painting, where artists like Pietro da Cortona and later Andrea Pozzo were creating visual experiences that seemed to dissolve the very boundaries of architectural space. In churches and palaces across Europe, painted ceilings opened up into infinite heavenly vistas, where saints and angels moved with such convincing three-dimensionality that viewers felt that they could join the celestial choreography simply by reaching upward. Enter the Church of Sant'Ignazio in Rome around 1685, where Pozzo has painted a ceiling that doesn't just represent heaven, it seems to be heaven, a direct visual portal into divine reality. Stand on the marked spot in the nave floor and look up. The architectural elements painted on the flat ceiling appear to extend the actual architecture of the church upward into infinity. Saints and angels seem to float in real space above your head, while divine light streams down from sources that exist only in paint. yet feel more real than any earthly illumination. This is trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye, painting raised to the level of spiritual technology. Bozo isn't just creating convincing illusions. He's engineering experiences of transcendence, manufacturing direct encounters with divine reality through pure artistic skill. Here's what makes these achievements so remarkable. Baroque artists were working without any of the technological aids available to modern illusionists. No electric lighting, no photography, no digital enhancement. They achieved their overwhelming effects through pure understanding of human psychology, through encyclopedic knowledge of how light, color, and form affect consciousness. But there's a deeper revolution happening in Baroque art, one that changes the fundamental relationship between art and viewer. Renaissance art had invited contemplation, encouraged viewers to study and admire from a respectful distance. Baroque art demands participation, pulls viewers into the artistic experience so completely that the boundary between observer and observed begins to dissolve. Consider Caravaggio's Judith beheading Holofernes, where the violence is so immediate, so viscerally convincing, that viewers instinctively step back from the canvas, or Bernini's Apollo and Daphne, where the transformation of woman into tree happens with such dynamic energy that viewers feel they're witnessing the actual moment of metamorphosis. These aren't representations of events. They're events themselves, artistic happenings that continue to unfold each time someone encounters them. As the 17th century progressed, this theatrical approach to art spread throughout Europe, adapted to local tastes and traditions, but always maintaining that essential Baroque conviction that art's highest purpose was to move, to transform, to create experiences so intense they changed the people who underwent them. In France, Nicolas Poussin was creating paintings that combined classical restraint with Baroque emotional power, demonstrating that profound feeling could be expressed through perfect compositional harmony. In Flanders, Peter Paul Rubens was painting with such sensuous energy that his canvases seemed to pulse with biological life. In Holland, Rembrandt was discovering how light and shadow could be used to illuminate not just physical surfaces, but the inner workings of human psychology itself. Each of these artists, working in different countries and different styles, was participating in the same essential project, the expansion of art's power to affect human consciousness, the development of visual techniques so sophisticated they could induce specific emotional and spiritual states with scientific precision. But even as Baroque art reached its peak of theatrical effectiveness, new ideas were stirring that would challenge its fundamental assumptions. In the salons of Paris and the courts of European aristocracy, a new sensibility was emerging, one that valued intimacy over grandeur, elegance over power, pleasure over transformation. For in the perfumed boudoir of Versailles and the intimate drawing rooms of aristocratic Paris, artists were about to discover that art's power to enchant could be even more seductive than its power to transform, that beauty could be an end in itself, rather than a means to spiritual elevation. When art became pure delight, Versailles, 1720, in a salon painted the color of champagne and morning sky, something deliciously revolutionary is about to unfold. Madame de Pompadour adjusts her silk skirts and settles into a chair upholstered in rose-colored damask, while across from her, Antoine Watteau arranges his easel with the delicate precision of someone creating not just a portrait, but a philosophy of beauty itself. This isn't the thunderous drama of Baroque art. with its spiritual ecstasies and religious transformations. This is something entirely new. Art devoted not to the salvation of souls, but to the cultivation of pleasure, not to moral instruction, but to the refinement of sensibility. Watteau is about to paint not just what his patron looks like, but how it feels to be alive in a world where beauty exists for its own sake, where elegance is a form of wisdom, where the highest human achievement might be the perfection of graceful living itself. Close your eyes and enter this perfumed world with me. The air shimmers with the scent of roses and powdered wigs, while somewhere in the distance a harpsichord plays music as light and precise as spun sugar. This is the birth of Rococo art, from the French rocaille, meaning shell work, but that decorative term barely hints at the sophisticated hedonism being invented in salons and boudoirs across aristocratic Europe. Watch Watteau's brush move across the canvas with the lightness of a butterfly settling on silk. He's not painting with the dramatic chiaroscuro of Caravaggio or the monumental forms of Michelangelo. Instead, he's discovering how to capture the most ephemeral experiences. The play of afternoon light on satin, the half smile of someone enjoying a private joke, the particular melancholy that comes from knowing that all beautiful moments must end. This represents a complete revolution in what art is supposed to accomplish. For centuries, artists had been expected to elevate viewers toward higher truths, religious, moral, philosophical, but Rococo artists like Watteau were suggesting that life's highest pleasure might be the appreciation of beauty for its own sake, that there was a kind of wisdom to be found in the careful attention to sensuous experience. Picture the scandal this caused among traditional critics. Church authorities had spent centuries commissioning art that would inspire religious devotion. Political leaders had demanded paintings and sculptures that would demonstrate power and inspire civic virtue. But here was art that seemed to exist purely for the pleasure of looking at it, that celebrated not heroism or holiness, but the sophisticated appreciation of refined sensation. But there's something more profound happening in Watteau's work than mere hedonism. His paintings capture a particular psychological state, what the French called mélancolie galante, the bittersweet awareness that all pleasure is temporary, that beauty exists in constant tension with transience. Look at his masterpiece, Pilgrimage to Cythera, where elegantly dressed couples embark for the island of love. The scene glows with a romantic possibility, yet there's an undertone of wistfulness, a recognition that even perfect moments carry within them the seeds of their own passing. This emotional complexity, pleasure tinged with melancholy, beauty shadowed by awareness of time, represents something unprecedented in the history of art. Watteau is painting not just what people look like, but how it feels to be conscious, to be aware simultaneously of beauty and mortality, of desire and its inevitable frustrations. Travel with me to another Parisian salon around 1750, where Jean-Honoré Fragonard is pushing Rococo sensibility toward achievements that seem to capture pure joy in paint. His swing shows a young woman soaring through dappled sunlight, while her lover glimpses her from below, and an old man pushes the swing from behind, oblivious to the erotic game being played above his head. This isn't just a playful scene. It's a visual manifesto about the nature of pleasure itself. Fragonard is suggesting that the highest human experiences might be those moments when we lose ourselves completely in sensuous delight, when social conventions dissolve in the face of spontaneous joy. The painting technique mirrors the content, loose, spontaneous brushstrokes that seem to capture not just visual appearances, but the very feeling of movement, of fabric rustling, of laughter echoing through summer air. Here's what makes this revolutionary. Fragonard is painting with a freedom and spontaneity that matches the emotional content of his subjects. The brushwork itself becomes a form of pleasure, visible evidence of an artist so in love with the act of painting that technique and content merge into pure expression. This is art about joy, created with joyous abandon, form and content achieving perfect unity. Meanwhile, in Venice, Giovanni Battista Tiepolo is creating ceiling frescoes that transform Rococo lightness into something approaching the sublime. His Apollo and the continents in the Würzburg residence isn't just decoration. It's a visual celebration of the entire known world, painted with such airy brilliance that viewers feel they're floating among clouds and mythological beings in realms where gravity has been suspended by pure artistic will. Stand beneath Tiepolo's ceiling and look up. The architectural boundaries seem to dissolve entirely, replaced by infinite skies where allegorical figures move with the weightless grace of beings freed from earthly limitations. This is Rococo art achieving something approaching religious experience, but a religion devoted to beauty rather than doctrine, to transcendence through aesthetic rapture rather than moral instruction. But perhaps the most sophisticated Rococo achievement was happening in the realm of the decorative arts, where craftsmen were creating objects that integrated art into the very fabric of daily life. In the workshops of master cabinet makers like Charles Cresson and André Charles Boulle, furniture was becoming sculpture. Everyday objects were being transformed into occasions for aesthetic contemplation. Picture yourself in an 18th century Parisian hotel particulier, where every surface has been designed as an opportunity for visual pleasure. The walls are painted with pastoral scenes that seem to extend the room into idealized landscapes. The furniture curves and flows like frozen music, its surfaces decorated with marquetry so intricate it resembles painted miniatures executed in precious woods. Even the doorknobs and drawer pulls have been crafted with the attention to proportion and detail usually reserved for jewelry. This represents something unprecedented in the relationship between art and daily life. Instead of reserving artistic experience for special occasions, visits to churches or palaces, Rococo designers were integrating beauty into the most ordinary activities. Drinking chocolate became an aesthetic ritual when performed with porcelain designed by Sèvres artists. Writing a letter became an act of artistic appreciation when done at a desk by Riesener that was itself a masterpiece of sculptural furniture making. But there's a deeper philosophy embedded in this aesthetic saturation of daily life. Rococo artists and craftsmen understood that human consciousness is constantly being shaped by the objects and spaces we inhabit, that surrounding ourselves with beautiful things actually refines our capacity for aesthetic appreciation, that living with art changes us in ways that merely looking at art occasionally cannot achieve. Consider the revolution this represented in human self-understanding. Medieval people had seen themselves as pilgrims, passing through a fallen world toward eternal salvation. Renaissance humanists had emphasized the cultivation of virtue and the pursuit of eternal fame through great achievements, but Rococo culture was suggesting that life's purpose might be the sophisticated appreciation of temporal pleasures, that there was a kind of wisdom to be found in the perfect orchestration of sensuous experience. This philosophy reached its apotheosis in the work of François Boucher, whose paintings created an entire alternative universe where mythological mythological beings pursued love and pleasure in landscapes that never knew winter, age, or disappointment. His Venus consoling love doesn't just represent the goddess of beauty, it creates a visual environment so sensuously appealing that viewers experience a kind of aesthetic intoxication, a temporary escape from ordinary consciousness into realms where beauty reigns supreme. But Bausch's achievement goes deeper than mere escapism. His technique, the way he applies paint to create surfaces that seem to glow with inner light, the way he composes scenes that lead the eye in rhythms as satisfying as musical phrases, represents a complete mastery of art's power to induce specific emotional states. He's not just painting pretty pictures. He's engineering experiences of aesthetic bliss, so sophisticated they border on the spiritual. Here's a mystery that still puzzles art historians. How did Rococo artists achieve such perfect integration of technique and content, such seamless unity of form and feeling? Their paintings seem effortless, yet recent technical analysis reveals layers of preparation and calculation as complex as anything achieved by Renaissance masters. They were creating the illusion of spontaneity through methods of extraordinary sophistication. But even as Rococo art reached its peak of refined sensuality, new forces were stirring that would challenge its fundamental assumptions. The Enlightenment was promoting reason over feeling, moral instruction over aesthetic pleasure. Archaeological discoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum were revealing classical art forms of austere nobility that made Rococo decoration seem frivolous by comparison, and a new middle-class audience was emerging that demanded art with more serious moral content, more educational value, more connection to the practical concerns of everyday life. The tension between these competing visions of art's purpose would soon explode into open conflict. In the academies of Paris and London, artists were beginning to argue that art's highest calling wasn't the cultivation of pleasure, but the promotion of virtue, that beauty should serve moral purposes rather than existing for its own sake. A neoclassical revolution was brewing that would sweep away the perfumed artifice of Rococo culture and replace it with art devoted to heroism, sacrifice, and the eternal values that transcend historical change. But before that revolution could triumph, one more artistic discovery awaited, one that would reveal new depths in the relationship between art and human emotion, that would demonstrate that beauty and moral seriousness need not be enemies, that the highest art might be that which captures not just pleasure or virtue in isolation, but the full complexity of human experience in all its contradictory richness. For in the studios of Paris and the mountains of Germany, artists were about to discover that the human heart contained depths that neither classical restraint nor Rococo elegance had fully explored. Emotions so powerful, they would require entirely new forms of artistic expression to contain them. When art became the language of the heart, Paris, 1784. In the great salon of the Louvre, thousands of visitors press forward to witness something that will change forever how art relates to human emotion. Jacques Louis David's Oath of the Hirashi doesn't just hang on the wall. It dominates the space like a visual thunderbolt, its crystalline clarity and moral intensity making every other painting in the exhibition seem pale and insignificant by comparison. But this isn't just artistic triumph, it's cultural revolution. David has rejected everything Rococo culture valued: sensuous pleasure, decorative elegance, the cultivation of refined sensation. Instead, he's created an image of such austere nobility, such uncompromising moral seriousness, that viewers feel challenged rather than charmed. elevated rather than entertained. The three Roman brothers stretched their hands toward their father's outstretched swords, swearing to die for their city's honor, while their women collapse in grief at the prospect of impending loss. Close your eyes and enter this pivotal moment with me. The salon buzzes with excited conversation as aristocrats and bourgeois citizens crowd around David's canvas, many of them weeping openly at its emotional power. This is the birth of neoclassicism, but that term doesn't capture the real revolution happening here. This is the moment when art claims the right to shape public consciousness, to influence political behavior, to serve as visual legislation for how citizens should think and feel. Watch how David has orchestrated every element for maximum emotional impact. The composition divides clearly into male and female spheres, the men standing rigid with patriotic determination, the women collapsing under the weight of impending loss. The architecture frames the scene with classical columns that suggest eternal values, while the lighting illuminates each figure with the clarity of absolute moral conviction. David isn't just painting a historical scene. He's creating visual propaganda so powerful it will help trigger the French Revolution. His art demonstrates that images can be weapons, that beauty in service of noble ideals possesses political force capable of toppling governments and reshaping entire civilizations. But here's what makes this moment truly revolutionary. David is discovering that classical forms, those Greek and Roman artistic principles that had been rediscovered during the Renaissance, could be charged with contemporary emotional content. That ancient artistic vocabulary could express thoroughly modern political and social ideas. He's not imitating classical art, he's weaponizing it. Picture the impact this had on 18th century consciousness. For generations, art had been either religious instruction or aristocratic entertainment. Suddenly, David was demonstrating that it could be civic education, moral philosophy, even revolutionary manifesto. His Brutus, painted just as the French Revolution was beginning, shows the Roman consul receiving news of his son's execution, sons he himself had condemned for treason. The painting doesn't just illustrate a classical story, it poses an urgent contemporary question. Are their values worth more than family loyalty? Can personal sacrifice serve the greater good? But David's neoclassical revolution was just one response to the cultural upheavals of the late 18th century. Across Europe, other artists were exploring different ways to expand art's emotional range and social relevance. In England, William Blake was creating images that bypassed rational consciousness entirely, speaking directly to what he called the spiritual sensation, through symbols and forms that seemed to emerge from dreams rather than observation. Enter Blake's workshop around 1795, where he's developing his revolutionary technique of illuminated printing, a method that allows him to combine poetry and visual art into unified experiences that engage both logical and intuitive understanding simultaneously. His songs of innocence and experience aren't just illustrated books, they're multimedia artworks, where every element contributes to complex meditations on human nature and spiritual possibility. Watch Blake work on his Ancient of Days, that famous image of the divine creator reaching down with a golden compass to establish the boundaries of creation. Each line is both precise and visionary, each color both naturalistic and symbolic. Blake is discovering that art can serve as a direct language for spiritual insights that can't be expressed in words alone, that images can convey truths about human existence that logical discourse inevitably obscures or reduces. Here's what makes Blake's approach revolutionary. He's rejecting the entire tradition of art as representation in favor of art as revelation. His figures don't look like actual people because they're not meant to. They're visual embodiments of spiritual forces, psychological states, cosmic principles that exist beyond the physical world, yet shape everything that happens within it. But the most profound artistic revolution of the late 18th century was happening in the realm of landscape painting, where artists were discovering that nature itself could serve as the primary subject for art that was both emotionally powerful and spiritually significant. Caspar David Friedrich, working in Dresden around 1810, was creating images that didn't just represent natural scenes, but used those scenes as vehicles for exploring the deepest questions about human existence and our relationship to the infinite. Stand with me on a cliff overlooking the Baltic Sea, watching Friedrich paint one of his mysterious figures seen from behind, contemplating vast expanses of sea and sky. This isn't just nature documentation, it's visual philosophy, using the experience of solitude in nature as a meditation on human consciousness itself. The lone figure becomes every viewer. The infinite landscape becomes the mystery of existence. The act of looking becomes a form of prayer or contemplation. Friedrich's innovation lies in his understanding that landscape can be psychological rather than merely topographical. His wanderer above the sea of fog doesn't show a specific place at a particular time. It creates an emotional and spiritual environment where viewers can explore their own relationship to mystery, infinity, the sublime aspects of existence that dwarf human understanding, yet somehow affirm human dignity. This is the birth of Romanticism, that complex cultural movement that would transform not just art, but literature, music, philosophy, and human self-understanding itself. But in visual art, Romanticism meant something specific. The conviction that feeling was a more reliable guide to truth than reason. That individual emotional experience was more important than collective social conventions. That the highest art was that which captured not what things look like, but what they feel like to conscious beings capable of wonder, terror, and transcendent joy. Travel with me to another German studio, where Philipp Otto Runge is attempting something that seems impossible: to paint music itself, to create visual equivalents for the emotional effects of sound. His Times of Day series doesn't just represent morning, noon, evening, and night. It translates the psychological experiences associated with different times into visual form so pure it approaches abstraction. Watch Runge work on his morning, where naked children dance in landscapes that seem to pulse with the rhythms of natural growth and renewal. This isn't illustration of any specific scene or story. It's a direct expression of the feeling of beginnings, of potential energy, of consciousness awakening to its own creative possibilities. Runge is discovering that art can bypass narrative entirely and speak directly to emotional understanding. But the Romantic Revolution wasn't limited to German mysticism or English visionary poetry. In France, Théodore Géricault was demonstrating that contemporary events could be transformed into art as powerful as any classical or religious subject. His Raft of the Medusa, painted in 1819, takes a recent maritime disaster and transforms it into a meditation on human endurance, social injustice, and the struggle for survival that speaks to universal human experience. Look at how Géricault has composed this enormous canvas. The survivors of the shipwreck are arranged in a pyramid that leads the eye from the corpses in the foreground to the figure waving desperately at a ship barely visible on the horizon. This isn't just documentation of a historical event. It's a visual metaphor for the human condition itself. our collective struggle against forces beyond our control, our desperate hope for salvation that may or may not come. But Jericho's real innovation lies in his technique. He painted this masterpiece by studying actual corpses in morgues, by building a scale model of the raft and floating it in tanks of water to observe how light and shadow would fall across the forms. He's combining romantic emotional intensity with scientific observation, using empirical methods to achieve effects of maximum psychological impact. This marriage of emotional power and technical sophistication reaches its peak in the work of Eugène Delacroix, whose paintings seem to capture pure passion in visual form. His Liberty Leading the People doesn't just commemorate the July Revolution of 1830. It creates an icon of revolutionary energy, so powerful it has inspired political movements across the globe for nearly 2 centuries. Enter Delacroix's studio around 1830, where he's developing painting techniques that can capture not just visual appearances, but emotional energies themselves. Watch his brush attack the canvas with controlled violence, building up surfaces that seem to vibrate with inner life. His color relationships don't just represent what things look like. They reproduce the psychological effects of intense experience, the way consciousness itself feels during moments of extreme emotion. Here's the technical revolution hidden within romantic expressiveness. Artists like Delacroix were discovering that visible brushstrokes, rather than being signs of incomplete craftsmanship, could actually enhance emotional impact by making viewers aware of the human energy that went into creating each image. The gesture of the artist's hand becomes part of the artwork's content, evidence of passion and conviction that makes the final image more convincing rather than less. But there's an even deeper revolution happening in romantic art, one that transforms the fundamental relationship between artists and their culture. Romantic artists were beginning to see themselves not as servants of patron or church or state, but as independent voices whose primary loyalty was to their own vision and emotional truth. Art was becoming a form of personal expression rather than public service, individual revelation rather than collective instruction. This shift had profound implications that extended far beyond art itself. If artists could claim the right to express personal vision, regardless of social expectations, then perhaps other individuals could make similar claims for autonomy and self-determination. Romantic art was contributing to the same cultural forces that were producing democratic revolution, individual rights, and the modern understanding of human dignity. Consider Caspar David Friedrich's Two Men Contemplating the Moon, where 2 figures stand in silhouette against a luminous night sky. This simple scene embodies an entire philosophy, that individual consciousness in dialogue with the natural world can achieve insights unavailable to collective social understanding. The painting doesn't tell viewers what to think. It creates a space for contemplation where personal revelation becomes possible. But even as romantic artists were exploring the depths of individual emotional experience, new challenges were emerging that would test their commitment to feeling over social engagement. The Industrial Revolution was transforming European society at unprecedented speed, creating new forms of poverty and social dislocation that demanded artistic response. Meanwhile, political revolutions were reshaping the very foundations of social order, raising questions about art's responsibility to address collective rather than merely personal concerns. These tensions would soon produce another artistic revolution, one that would challenge romantic inwardness with documentary realism, that would insist art's highest purpose was not emotional expression, but social truth-telling that would transform artists from visionaries into witnesses, and art itself into a tool for social reform and political change. For in the rapidly changing cities of industrial Europe, artists were about to confront realities so harsh they would force a complete reconsideration of art's relationship to society, discovering that beauty itself might need to be redefined in an age when the greatest human need was not transcendence, but justice, not escape, but engagement with the urgent realities of modern life. When art became social conscience, Paris, 1850, in a cramped studio in Montmartre, something revolutionary is about to emerge that will challenge every assumption about what art should be, what subjects are worthy of artistic attention, what the relationship between beauty and truth actually means. Gustave Courbet stands before a canvas larger than those traditionally reserved for history paintings of gods and heroes. But he's not planning to paint mythology or biblical scenes. Instead, he's preparing to immortalize something unprecedented. Ordinary working people engaged in the most mundane of activities. His stone breakers will show two men doing back-breaking labor on a country road. No nobility in their posture, no romantic idealization of their condition, no suggestion that their suffering serves any higher purpose. Just the brutal reality of people forced to destroy their bodies to earn enough to eat another day. And Courbet is going to paint this with the same monumental dignity, the same technical perfection, traditionally reserved for saints and emperors. Close your eyes and enter this revolutionary moment with me. The studio smells of linseed oil and turpentine, but underneath those familiar artists' scents lurks something new, the odor of actual labor, of authentic working-class life being studied and documented with the intensity usually devoted to classical sculptures or Renaissance masterpieces. This is the birth of realism, but that term barely captures the radical transformation of artistic consciousness happening here. Watch Courbet apply paint to canvas with the confident strokes of someone who has spent months studying how sunlight actually falls across the bent backs of actual laborers, how dust and sweat accumulate on real skin, how worn clothing drapes over bodies shaped by lifetimes of physical work. He's not romanticizing poverty or making it picturesque. He's documenting it with the unflinching honesty of someone who believes that art's highest purpose is bearing witness to truth, regardless of whether that truth is beautiful or comfortable. Here's what makes this approach revolutionary. Courbet is insisting that any human experience worthy of attention is worthy of great art, that the traditional hierarchy placing mythological and religious subjects above contemporary social reality is artificial and ultimately immoral. He's democratizing not just art's subjects, but art's audience, creating paintings that speak to anyone capable of recognizing the dignity inherent in honest labor. But Courbet's revolution goes deeper than subject matter. He's developing painting techniques that match his social philosophy, direct, honest, unadorned with unnecessary refinement. His brushwork is visible. His colors are the actual colors of earth and sky and working clothes, rather than the idealized harmonies of academic tradition. He's making artistic technique itself a form of moral statement, insisting that how you paint is as important as what you paint. Picture the scandal this caused in mid-19th century Paris, where art was expected to elevate viewers above the concerns of daily life, to provide escape from social realities rather than confrontation with them. Courbet was offering something entirely different. Art as social documentation, beauty redefined as truth-telling, aesthetic experience transformed into moral education. But Courbet's social realism was just one response to the upheavals of industrial society. Travel with me to another Parisian studio around 1860, where Edouard Manet is conducting his own revolution against artistic tradition, not by changing art's subjects, but by transforming its entire visual language. His Olympia, painted in 1863, appears to show a traditional subject, a reclining nude in the pose made famous by Titian's Venus of Urbino centuries earlier. But look more carefully. This isn't a goddess or mythological figure. She's a contemporary Parisian prostitute, painted with such direct honesty that her profession is unmistakable. Her gaze meets the viewers with challenging directness, while her black cat, symbol of sexuality, and the flowers delivered by her maid make the commercial nature of the encounter explicit. Here's the technical revolution hidden within this scandalous content. Manet is painting without the careful modeling and graduated shadows that had defined European art since the Renaissance. Instead, he's using bold contrasts of light and dark, flat areas of color that emphasize the painted surface rather than creating illusions of three-dimensional space. He's discovering that artistic truth might require breaking the very techniques that create convincing realism. This represents a complete philosophical shift in artistic thinking. Since the Renaissance, artists had devoted enormous energy to perfecting illusions of reality. But Manet is suggesting that art's power might actually increase when it admits to being art, when it emphasizes its own artificial nature, rather than pretending to be transparent windows onto reality. Watch Manet work on his technique in the Olympia. He applies paint in bold, visible strokes that make viewers aware they're looking at pigment on canvas rather than living flesh. Yet somehow, this artificial honesty makes the painting more psychologically powerful rather than less. By refusing to disguise the fact that this is a painted image, Manet forces viewers to confront both the subject matter and their own act of looking, their own complicity in the visual consumption of another human being. But the real revolution in 19th century art was happening outdoors, where a group of young painters was making discoveries that would transform not just technique, but the entire relationship between art and immediate experience. The Impressionists, working in the forests around Paris and along the Seine, were discovering that reality itself was far more complex and changeable than any studio painting could capture. Picture yourself with Claude Monet in his garden at Argenteuil around 1875, watching him set up his easel before a haystack that he's painted dozens of times before. But today's light is different from yesterday's. This hour's atmosphere distinct from this morning's. Monet is discovering that there's no such thing as permanent visual reality, that everything we see is constantly changing, constantly being transformed by shifts in light, weather, season, time of day. Watch his brush capture effects that had never been painted before. The way morning mist makes distant objects seem to dissolve into atmosphere. The way afternoon sun creates colors that don't actually exist in the objects themselves, but emerge from the interaction between light and surface. The way shadows contain not gray or black, but reflected colors from surrounding objects. This is more than technical innovation. It's a complete revolution in consciousness itself. Monet is discovering that what we take for solid, objective reality is actually a fluid interplay of light, color, and atmospheric conditions that changes constantly. He's not painting things. He's painting the experience of seeing things, the subjective, personal, constantly shifting nature of visual encounter itself. Here's the philosophical implication. If reality is as changeable as Impressionist paintings suggest, then perhaps truth itself needs to be understood as multiple, personal, dependent on perspective and circumstance, rather than fixed and universal. Impressionism isn't just an artistic technique, it's a new way of understanding the nature of existence itself. But other artists were pushing these discoveries in different directions. Paul Cézanne, working in isolation in Provence, was discovering that the Impressionist dissolution of form into light and color could be reversed, that solid architectural structures could be built up from pure color relationships without any dependence on traditional drawing or modeling. Stand with Cézanne before Mont Sainte-Victoire around 1885, watching him translate that massive limestone mountain into a construction of colored brushstrokes that somehow captures both the geological permanence of stone and the constantly changing effects of Mediterranean light. He's not painting what the mountain looks like. He's discovering visual principles that could allow artists to construct any conceivable reality from relationships of color and form alone. Cézanne's brushstrokes don't follow the contours of objects or try to create smooth illusions of surface texture. Instead, each stroke is a building block in a visual architecture that exists according to its own laws, rather than those of naturalistic representation. He's discovering that art can be completely artificial and completely truthful simultaneously, that painted realities can possess structural logic more convincing than photographic documentation. Meanwhile, in the cabarets and brothels of Montmartre, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec was developing his own approach to artistic truth-telling. His paintings and posters of dancers, prostitutes, and bohemian nightlife didn't idealize or condemn their subjects. They captured them with an honesty so complete it revealed the humanity and dignity present in lives that conventional society preferred to ignore. Watch Toulouse-Lautrec work on his At the Moulin Rouge, capturing not just what the famous cabaret looked like, but what it felt like. The harsh electric lighting that flattened faces into theatrical masks. The artificial gaiety that barely concealed deeper hungers and disappointments. The mixture of pleasure and desperation that characterized urban nightlife in the age of industrial capitalism. His technique matches his subject matter. Rapid, economical strokes that capture essential gestures and expressions without unnecessary detail. Colors that emphasize the artificial lighting of interior spaces, rather than the natural harmonies of traditional painting. Toulouse-Lautrec is discovering that modern life requires modern artistic techniques, that new social realities demand new forms of visual expression. But here's what unites all these different approaches to late 19th century art. They're all responding to the recognition that traditional artistic conventions, whether classical idealism, romantic emotion, or academic technique, are inadequate to the realities of modern experience, industrial society, democratic politics, scientific understanding, urban life. All of these were creating new forms of human experience that required new forms of artistic expression. The result was an explosion of artistic experimentation, unlike anything seen since the Renaissance. Artists were testing every assumption about what art could be, what subjects it could address, what techniques it could employ, what effects it could achieve. They were discovering that the boundaries of artistic possibility were far wider than anyone had imagined. Georges Seurat, working with almost scientific precision, was discovering that color relationships could be systematized according to optical principles, that paintings could be constructed from thousands of tiny dots of pure color, that would blend in the viewer's eye to create effects more luminous than any traditional painting technique. His Sunday on La Grande Jatte represents the culmination of this pointillist approach, a painting that's simultaneously completely artificial in technique and completely convincing in its recreation of specific light conditions and social atmospheres. But perhaps the most profound discovery of late 19th century art was that individual artistic vision, the personal way each artist saw and interpreted reality, was itself a subject worthy of artistic exploration. Artists were beginning to understand that their own consciousness, their own unique way of experiencing the world, was as interesting and valuable as any external subject matter. This recognition would soon lead to discoveries that would shatter the last remaining connections between art and conventional reality, that would launch art into territories of pure invention and personal expression that no previous generation had even imagined possible. The stage was being set for the most radical revolution in the history of human artistic achievement. For in the studios of Paris and the galleries of new American cities, artists were about to embark on adventures so radical they would abandon representation entirely, creating art forms that existed according to their own laws, rather than those of the visible world, opening territories of pure visual possibility that would expand the definition of art beyond anything previously imagined. When art escaped the world entirely, Paris, 1907. In a cluttered studio in Montmartre, Pablo Picasso stands before a canvas that will destroy 5 centuries of artistic tradition in a single revolutionary image. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon doesn't just break the rules of painting, it announces that those rules no longer apply, that art has grown beyond the need to represent visual reality and can now create realities of its own that are more powerful, more truthful, more psychologically penetrating than anything mere observation could achieve. The 5 women in the painting don't look human in any conventional sense. Their faces are reconstructed from geometric fragments that show multiple viewpoints simultaneously. Their bodies are reduced to angular planes that suggest volume without creating convincing illusions of 3-dimensional form. Their eyes stare directly at viewers with an intensity that's both primordial and completely modern, like African masks meeting urban anxiety in a collision that produces entirely new forms of visual consciousness. Close your eyes and enter this earth-shaking moment with me. The studio air is thick with cigarette smoke and heated arguments, as visitors struggle to understand what Picasso has accomplished. Even his closest artist friends are baffled, disturbed, sometimes horrified by what they're seeing. This isn't just a new painting style. It's the annihilation of painting, as it has been understood since Giotto first made flat walls seem to open onto convincing 3-dimensional spaces. But why this radical break with representational tradition? Picasso is responding to discoveries that are reshaping human understanding of reality itself. Einstein's theories are revealing that space and time aren't fixed and absolute, but relative and interdependent. Freudian psychology is demonstrating that consciousness isn't rational and unified, but fragmented and driven by unconscious forces. Anthropological studies of African and oceanic art are showing that Western representational traditions are just one possible approach among many, not the inevitable goal toward which all art must evolve. Watch Picasso work on those revolutionary faces, incorporating influences from Iberian sculpture, African masks, and his own analytical investigation of how forms can be broken down into geometric components and reassembled according to principles of psychological rather than optical truth. He's not trying to show what these women look like. He's trying to capture what they feel like to encounter, the immediate impact of confronting female sexuality without the protective barriers of conventional beauty or idealization. This is the birth of Cubism, but that label doesn't capture the real revolution happening here. This is the moment when art claims the right to organize reality according to its own principles, rather than those of natural appearance. When artists begin creating visual languages that can express aspects of experience that naturalistic representation inevitably misses or distorts. Picture the workspace Picasso shares with Georges Braque around 1910, where together they're developing Cubist principles through collaborative experimentation that resembles scientific research more than traditional artistic practice. They're analyzing how objects appear from multiple viewpoints simultaneously, how forms can be broken down into geometric components and rebuilt according to purely aesthetic logic, how color and texture can function independently of descriptive requirements. Watch Braque work on his violin and candlestick, where a musical instrument is simultaneously seen from above, from the side, from inside and outside, past and present, all combined into a single image that captures not what a violin looks like, but what it means, its function as sound producer, its cultural significance, its formal beauty as constructed object. This isn't representation, it's analysis made visual, understanding translated into artistic form. But Cubism's real achievement lies in its demonstration that art can be completely non-naturalistic, yet still powerfully meaningful. By freeing themselves from the obligation to create convincing illusions, Picasso and Braque discovered they could express ideas, emotions, and insights that representational art couldn't approach. They were creating visual thinking rather than visual recording. Meanwhile, in another part of Paris, Henri Matisse was conducting his own revolution against traditional artistic values. But where Picasso was exploring intellectual analysis, Matisse was pursuing pure emotional expression through color relationships that owed nothing to natural observation and everything to psychological effect. Enter Matisse's studio around 1905, where he's developing the approach that will earn him and his associates the name fauves, wild beasts. His woman with a hat doesn't show what his model actually looked like. It translates the experience of encountering her into a symphony of colors so bold, so emotionally direct, that viewers feel they're seeing not just a person, but the artist's entire emotional response to that person. Watch Matisse apply pure vermilion to paint shadows, emerald green to model flesh, cobalt blue to suggest the texture of hair. These aren't the colors of natural appearance. They're the colors of feeling itself, of psychological response translated directly into visual form. Matisse is discovering that color can function as pure emotion, that paintings can affect viewers the way music does, directly, immediately, without the mediation of recognizable subject matter. Here's what makes this revolutionary. Matisse is demonstrating that art's power to move and transform viewers doesn't depend on representation at all, that visual relationships, color interacting with color, form responding to form, can create experiences as profound as any literary narrative or philosophical argument. But the most radical experiments were happening in Germany, where Wassily Kandinsky was pushing these discoveries toward their logical conclusion. Complete abstraction, art that abandoned representation entirely in favor of pure visual music. His composition, The Seventh, painted in 1913, doesn't represent anything in the external world. Instead, it creates its own reality from relationships of color, line, and form that exist according to purely aesthetic principles. Stand before one of Kandinsky's abstract paintings and let your eyes follow the visual rhythms he's created. Lines sweep across the canvas like melodies made visible. Colors clash and harmonize with the same emotional logic that governs musical composition. Forms emerge and dissolve like thoughts forming in consciousness itself. Kandinsky is creating art that speaks directly to what he calls spiritual sensation, immediate, intuitive understanding that bypasses rational analysis entirely. This represents the most radical break with artistic tradition in human history. For 40,000 years since the first cave paintings, art had been about representation, making images of things that existed in the world. Suddenly, Kandinsky was demonstrating that art could abandon that relationship entirely, that it could create experiences that had never existed before, that existed nowhere except in the artistic encounter itself. But why was this revolution happening now, in the early years of the 20th century? The answer lies in a convergence of cultural forces that made traditional artistic approaches seem inadequate to contemporary experience. Industrial technology was creating new forms of beauty. The streamlined efficiency of machines, the geometric patterns of steel construction, the dynamic energy of urban life. Meanwhile, new scientific understanding was revealing that the universe itself was far stranger and more complex than classical physics had suggested. Artists were responding to these challenges by developing visual languages capable of expressing aspects of modern experience that traditional representation couldn't address. The speed of modern life, the psychological complexity revealed by psychoanalysis, the social fragmentation produced by industrial capitalism, the spiritual uncertainty created by scientific materialism. All of these required new forms of artistic expression. But there's an even deeper revolution happening here, one that transforms the fundamental purpose of art itself. Instead of serving religion, state, or social convention, modern art was becoming a form of pure research into the possibilities of human consciousness. Artists were becoming explorers of inner space, cartographers of emotional and spiritual territories that had never been mapped before. Consider Piet Mondrian's evolution from naturalistic landscape painter to creator of geometric abstractions that reduce all visual experience to relationships between straight lines and primary colors. His Broadway boogie-woogie doesn't represent New York City. It captures the essential rhythm and energy of urban experience in a visual form that's simultaneously completely artificial and completely truthful to the psychological reality of modern metropolitan life. Watch Mondrian work on these compositions with the precision of someone solving complex mathematical equations. Each line is positioned according to principles of proportion and balance that he's derived from years of studying natural forms and reducing them to their essential structural relationships. He's not just making decorative patterns. He's discovering visual principles that reveal the underlying order present in all natural and cultural phenomena. But perhaps the most important discovery of early modern art was that individual artistic vision, the unique way each artist perceived and interpreted reality, was itself worthy of systematic exploration. Artists were learning that their own consciousness, their personal way of processing visual and emotional experience, was as interesting and valuable as any external subject matter. This recognition led to an explosion of individual artistic styles unprecedented in history. Where previous artistic periods had been characterized by shared approaches and common techniques, modern art became a laboratory for testing every conceivable approach to visual expression. Expressionism, futurism, Dadaism, surrealism. Each movement represented a different investigation into art's possibilities, a different answer to the question of what art could accomplish in modern life. The result was art that functioned less like decoration or illustration and more like philosophy or scientific research, systematic investigation into the nature of consciousness, perception, emotion, and meaning itself. Modern artists weren't just making beautiful objects. They were expanding human understanding of what consciousness could accomplish, what individual creativity could achieve, what art itself could become when freed from all traditional limitations. But even as artists achieved this unprecedented freedom from conventional restrictions, they were also losing something that had sustained art for millennia: clear social purpose, shared cultural meaning, connection to community needs and values. The price of artistic freedom was our artistic isolation, the transformation of art from public language into private expression, from social glue into individual adventure. This tension between freedom and relevance, between innovation and accessibility, would define artistic struggle throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Artists had gained the right to create anything they could imagine, but they had lost the guarantee that anyone would understand or care about what they created. The stage was set for new discoveries about art's relationship to technology, popular culture, and global society. For in the galleries of New York and the studios of emerging global art centers, artists were about to confront the ultimate challenge: how to maintain art's power to transform consciousness in an age of mass media, digital reproduction, and planetary communication. How to keep the ancient magic of visual creation alive in a world where images multiply beyond counting, and meaning itself seems to fragment into infinite possibilities. Where art becomes everything and everything becomes art. New York City, 1962. In a converted warehouse in Lower Manhattan, Andy Warhol stands before a silk screen press, preparing to create something that will fundamentally challenge what art means in the age of mass reproduction. He's not painting a unique, handcrafted object that will hang in a single location and be seen by a privileged few. Instead, he's making multiple identical images of a Campbell's soup can, transforming the most mundane consumer product into an art object that will force viewers to reconsider the boundary between commercial culture and high artistic achievement. This isn't just pop art. It's a complete revolution in artistic consciousness. Warhol is suggesting that in an age when mechanical reproduction makes every image infinitely copyable, the traditional concept of unique artistic creation has become obsolete. Why paint something that exists nowhere else when you can transform something that already exists everywhere into an occasion for aesthetic contemplation? Close your eyes and enter this transformed artistic landscape with me. The warehouse hums with the sounds of industrial production, printing presses, mechanical timers, the conversations of assistants who are learning that making art can be as systematic and collaborative as running a factory. This is the factory, Warhol's studio, and it's organized according to principles that would have horrified traditional artists, but that perfectly capture the reality of cultural production in the electronic age. Watch Warhol work on his Maryland series, silk screening Monroe's publicity photograph, in colors that transform her from Hollywood icon into meditation on fame, mortality, and the artificial nature of celebrity identity. Each print is identical, yet slightly different. Mechanical reproduction, combined with expressive variation, mass production techniques, serving artistic rather than commercial purposes. Here's what makes this revolutionary. Warhol is discovering that art's power to affect consciousness doesn't depend on uniqueness or handcraft. A silk-screened image can be as emotionally powerful as an oil painting. A photograph can serve as the foundation for artistic transformation as effectively as direct observation. He's democratizing both the production and consumption of art, making artistic experience available to anyone with access to mass-produced images. But Warhol's revolution is just one response to the challenges facing art in the late 20th century. Travel with me to another kind of studio, the computer lab at Bell Laboratories around 1965, where artists and engineers are collaborating to create the first digital artworks. Here, visual experiences are being generated not through paint and canvas, but through mathematical algorithms and electronic displays. Watch as programmers enter equations that generate visual patterns no human hand could draw, that exist only as relationships between numbers, yet create aesthetic experiences as powerful as any traditional medium. This is the birth of digital art, but it represents something more profound: the recognition that art and technology aren't opposites, but natural partners in the expansion of human creative possibility. Consider what this means for artistic tradition. Since the first cave painters mixed pigments and applied them to stone walls, art had been about physical materials, transformed through human skill into meaningful images. Suddenly, artists could create experiences that existed only as information, that could be transmitted instantly across global networks, that could be modified and recombined in ways that made every viewer a potential collaborator in the creative process. But the real revolution was happening in the conceptual foundations of art itself. By the 1970s, artists like Joseph Beuys were creating social sculptures, art projects that existed not as objects, but as social processes, community interactions, collaborative investigations into how creative activity could serve healing, education, and social transformation. Picture yourself in one of Beuys's performances, where the artist appears wrapped in felt and fat, materials he associates with warmth, protection, and spiritual transformation. He's not creating objects for contemplation, but situations for participation. Art experiences that exist only in the living encounter between artist and audience, that can't be bought or sold or preserved in museums because they consist entirely of temporary human relationships. This is conceptual art at its most radical. The recognition that art's essence lies not in any material form, but in ideas, experiences, and social interactions that can take any conceivable form. Beuys is suggesting that everyone is an artist, that artistic consciousness is a basic human capacity rather than a specialized professional skill, that the ultimate artwork might be the transformation of society itself through creative collaboration. But even as art expanded into these dematerialized territories, other artists were exploring how traditional media could be pushed beyond their apparent limitations. In the galleries of New York's Soho district, painters like Gerhard Richter were creating works that existed simultaneously as abstract paintings and photographic images, that used traditional oil painting techniques to explore questions about representation and reality that could only be addressed in the age of mechanical reproduction. Watch Richter work on his photo paintings, where family snapshots and newspaper images are translated into oil paint with such technical precision that viewers can't tell whether they're looking at photographs or paintings. But then he draws a squeegee across the wet paint, creating streaks and blurs that simultaneously destroy and enhance the image, that make viewers aware they're encountering not reality itself, but multiple layers of representation and interpretation. This isn't just technical experimentation, it's philosophical investigation into the nature of memory, truth, and visual knowledge itself. Richter is discovering that in an age saturated with photographic images, painting's unique contribution might be its ability to make us conscious of the act of seeing, to slow down our visual consumption enough that we become aware of how images actually affect consciousness. Meanwhile, in the emerging art centers of Los Angeles, London, and Berlin, artists were exploring how art could engage with global communication networks, consumer culture, and the accelerating pace of technological change. Jeff Koons was creating sculptures from mass-produced toys and household objects, transforming kitsch into high art through strategies of scale, material, and gallery context that forced viewers to reconsider their assumptions about value, taste, and cultural hierarchy. But perhaps the most profound transformation was happening in the realm of installation art, where artists like James Turrell were creating experiences that existed somewhere between art, architecture, and pure perceptual experiment. His sky spaces, rooms designed to frame and focus attention on natural light and sky, don't contain art objects. Instead, they transform viewers' awareness of their own perceptual processes, making consciousness itself the subject of artistic investigation. Enter one of Turrell's installations at sunset, when carefully calculated apertures frame the darkening sky in ways that make you hyper-aware of how vision actually works, how consciousness constructs reality from light and color and atmospheric condition. You're not looking at art. You're experiencing the artistic transformation of awareness itself, the conversion of ordinary perceptual process into occasions for contemplation and wonder. This represents the logical conclusion of art's long evolution from cave painting to digital installation, the recognition that art's ultimate subject might be consciousness itself, that the highest artistic achievement might be the creation of conditions under which viewers become more aware of their own awareness, more conscious of the creative processes through which they construct their sense of reality. But as art has gained this philosophical sophistication and conceptual freedom, it has also faced unprecedented challenges. In an age when everyone carries a device capable of creating and sharing images instantly, when artificial intelligence can generate convincing artworks in seconds, when global art markets treat cultural artifacts as investment commodities, what unique value does traditional artistic creation still possess? The answer lies not in art's products, but in its processes, not in what artists make, but in how they think, how they see, how they transform raw experience into forms that can be shared and understood by others. Art's essential contribution to human culture has always been its capacity to make the invisible visible, to give form to insights and emotions that can't be expressed through ordinary language or logical analysis. Consider the work of contemporary artists like Ai Weiwei, who creates installations that function simultaneously as aesthetic objects and political statements, that use traditional artistic media to address urgent global issues while maintaining the visual power and emotional impact that distinguish art from journalism or propaganda. His dropping a Han Dynasty urn doesn't just document the destruction of an ancient artifact. It creates a meditation on cultural value, historical continuity, and the artist's responsibility to challenge authority through creative action. Or think about Marina Abramovich's performance art, where the artist's own body becomes the medium for exploring questions about presence, duration, and the limits of human endurance. Her work exists only in the temporary encounters between artist and audience, yet creates memories and insights that can last lifetimes, that change how participants understand their own capacity for attention, empathy, and psychological transformation. This is art as direct experience rather than representation of experience. The completion of a circle that began when humans first discovered they could make marks on cave walls that would communicate across time and space. But now, instead of representing external reality, art has become a tool for investigating and expanding consciousness itself. As we reach the end of our journey through art history, consider what remains constant through all these transformations. Whether we're talking about Paleolithic cave painters or contemporary digital artists, the essential impulse remains the same: the human need to give form to inner experience, to create objects and experiences that can communicate what it feels like to be conscious in a world of overwhelming complexity and beauty. The Islamic geometric patterns we explored earlier were attempts to visualize the infinite nature of divine reality. Medieval illuminated manuscripts were efforts to create books that functioned like doorways to heaven. Renaissance perspective was a technology for making painted surfaces disappear into convincing alternate realities. Baroque theatrical effects were methods for inducing spiritual transformation through visual experience. Romantic landscapes were ways of exploring the relationship between human consciousness and natural sublimity. Impressionist technique was investigation into the subjective, constantly changing nature of perceptual experience. Modern abstraction was research into consciousness itself, separated from any external referent. Each artistic revolution we've encountered represents another step in the same ongoing project: the attempt to understand and express what it means to be human, to be conscious, to be capable of creating meaning in a universe that doesn't provide ready-made significance. Art has always been humanity's laboratory for exploring the deepest questions about existence, reality, and possibility, and this project continues today in forms we can barely imagine. Virtual reality artists are creating immersive environments that make viewers into active participants in artistic narratives. Biotechnology artists are using living organisms as artistic media, creating works that evolve and change according to biological rather than mechanical principles. AI artists are collaborating with artificial intelligence to create images that emerge from machine learning processes, yet somehow capture recognizably human aesthetic sensibilities. But perhaps most importantly, art continues to serve its ancient function as a form of communication across the barriers that separate individual consciousness. When you stand before a painting that moves you to tears, when you encounter a sculpture that makes you see the world differently, when you experience an installation that transforms your understanding of space and time, you're participating in the same essential human activity that motivated those first cave painters 40,000 years ago. You're proving that consciousness can be shared, that individual insights can become collective wisdom, that the invisible realities of inner experience can be given forms that allow them to travel across cultures and centuries, to touch other minds, other hearts, other spirits capable of recognition and response. As the light fades in our imaginary gallery, and this journey through art history draws to its close, remember this: you've been witnessing the greatest adventure in human cultural development, the long struggle to understand and express what it means to be conscious beings, capable of creating meaning, beauty, and significance in a universe that offers raw materials but no instructions for their use. Art is the record of that struggle, the accumulated evidence of human creativity applied to the deepest questions of existence, and it continues today in studios and galleries and digital spaces around the world as new generations of artists discover new ways to make the invisible visible, to give form to insights that can't be expressed in any other way. Every brushstroke, every carved line, every composed pixel is part of the same ongoing conversation between human consciousness and the mystery of existence itself. And that conversation will continue as long as there are minds capable of wonder, hands capable of creation, and hearts brave enough to attempt the impossible task of translating inner vision into forms that can be shared with others. The gallery never closes. The conversation never ends. And somewhere, right now, someone is picking up a brush, or a chisel, or a stylus, and adding their voice to the greatest collaborative artwork in human history. The ongoing attempt to understand what it means to be alive, conscious, and creative in a universe full of infinite possibility, until we meet again in another gallery, in another time, for another journey through the endless territories of human creative possibility. Rest well, dream of colors you've never seen, and remember that every time you look at the world with truly attentive eyes, you're continuing the ancient tradition that began when someone first decided that reality was so beautiful, so meaningful, so worthy of preservation, that it deserved to be recreated through the magic of human artistic skill. Sleep peacefully in the knowledge that beauty continues to be created, that consciousness continues to explore its own depths, and that the conversation between human creativity and cosmic mystery continues in studios and galleries and digital spaces around our turning world.